Most people have never heard of Agrozet. That is fitting, since Agrozet built tractors, or at least that is what its paperwork said. Buried inside that agricultural engineering trust for most of the 1980s sat the factory that manufactured the standard rifle of the Czechoslovak army, exported small arms to a dozen countries, and employed the engineers behind one of the most quietly respected pistols in the world. A plant that would go on to build over 900,000 rifles for a war that never came, and a pistol still copied on 3 continents. That same factory's gate had also, at different points, read precision machine tooling, and for a stretch nobody who worked there enjoyed repeating Zavody Ryshové Revolus, the October Revolution works. We will get to why. You will probably hear this described as a story about a Cold War rifle. It is not. It is the story of a company good enough to survive Nazi occupation and Soviet domination, killed once by the ideology that built it, and killed it again, differently, when that ideology finally fell. The company began in Strakonice in 1919, when the newly formed Czechoslovak Republic chartered Jihočeska Zbrojovka to arm a country that had just been carved out of a collapsed empire. Czechoslovak arms design was already, by the late 1920s, among the best in the world. The sister firm in Brno had turned its ZB Vizor 26 light machine gun into an export phenomenon. 45,000 delivered to the Czechoslovak army, and another 100,000 sold abroad, the kind of weapon foreign militaries copied outright rather than merely admired. It grew fast enough that in the summer of 1936, with Nazi Germany's ambitions no longer deniable, the Czechoslovak government ordered a second, more modern plant built far from the western border, in the small Moravian town of Uherský Brod, population roughly 6,000. The new factory's roofline was designed to resemble ordinary housing blocks when viewed from the air. Within its first years, it was producing aircraft machine guns for the Czechoslovak Air Force, and was, by contemporary accounts, one of the most advanced small arms plants in the world. Then Germany annexed the country anyway, and the same buildings spent the war years producing machine guns for the Luftwaffe instead, with a brief, almost apologetic attempt at commercial air rifles squeezed in alongside the occupation orders. Liberation in 1945 did not return the factory to its owners. It was placed under state control immediately, a holding pattern that lasted 3 years until February 1948, when the Communist Party seized full power in Prague and nationalized what remained of Czechoslovak industry outright. The joint stock company that had run the plant since before the war dissolved into the state on paper in a matter of weeks. Uherský Brod kept building guns. What it lost was the ability to decide on its own terms what kind of company it was. That loss would compound for the next 40 years quietly, through paperwork rather than headlines, which is exactly why almost nobody outside the factory gates ever noticed it happening. By 1950, the plant had been spun off as an independent enterprise, no longer a branch of the Strakonice parent, and immediately absorbed into a planned economy that renamed it Presné Strojírenství, Precision Machine Tooling, a label with no reference to weapons at all. Under that name, and under state orders desperate for infantry firearms, the factory built the Model 48 submachine gun, redesignated the Vizor 23 and 25 in 1950. It was a genuinely original piece of engineering, the first production submachine gun built with a telescoping bolt wrapped around the barrel, a design choice that let engineers shrink the weapon's overall length without shrinking the barrel itself. By 1953, it had produced 545,000 of them, 345,000 chambered for the Soviet standard 7.62 mm Tokarev round. After Czechoslovakia joined the Warsaw Pact, the state needed the rifles badly enough to let the engineers work. It did not need the factory badly enough to let it keep its own name. 1952 brought the Vizor 52, adopted as Czechoslovakia's standard infantry rifle, and chambered for a proprietary 7.62 by 45 mm cartridge, more powerful than anything the Soviets issued and built specifically so the country would not depend on Moscow for ammunition. It worked well enough for a while, before its own design flaws became apparent under sustained use. Then in 1955, the Warsaw Pact was formalized, and Soviet authorities ended the argument outright. Every member state would standardize on the 7.62 by 39 mm round full stop, Czechoslovakia's own cartridge program, and the independence it represented, died in a single administrative decision made in Moscow, not Prague. Officials briefly discussed simply licensing the AK-47 outright and being done with it, closing the country's independent small arms design tradition entirely. That proposal was rejected too, and the decision to instead build something of their own is the reason this story has a riffle worth talking about at all. Instead, new requirements were issued. A rifle no heavier than 2.7 kilograms unloaded, no longer than 850 millimeters, ready in both fixed and folding stock versions. The project, codenamed Koste, meaning broom, began in January 1956 at the State Research Institute Konstrukta in Brno. Its chief designer, Jiří Čermák, was the youngest of the engineers competing for the contract, up against the Kauky brothers' ZK-503 and a design from Václav Holek, the man who had built the ZB-26 machine gun a generation earlier. Age and seniority meant nothing here. The state wanted a working rifle inside the weight limit, and it did not care whose name was already famous. Čermák's team solved the weight problem with a hinged locking block, a mechanism closer to a Walther P-38 pistol than anything in Kalashnikov's lineage, paired with a short-stroke gas piston and a striker-fired action nobody else in the competition had attempted. By autumn 1956, the prototype was in the Soviet Union for testing. It passed every trial and was judged comparable to the AK-47 in every category the Soviets measured. They were reportedly startled by its accuracy. A country that had just been told to give up its own cartridge quietly building a rifle its patrons' own testers had not expected to beat. The rifle entered Czechoslovak service in 1958, officially classified not as an assault rifle, but as a submachine gun. Samopal Vzor 58. Possibly to sidestep a term the Nazis had popularized, possibly just following the Soviet naming habit that gave the AK its own designation. Full production began at Uhersky Brod in 1959. Despite the visual resemblance that still gets it called a Kalashnikov clone by people who have never handled one, the Vzor 58 shared no parts with the AK-47, used a lighter aluminum alloy magazine that could be loaded through the bolt with stripper clips and locked open on an empty magazine, which the AK-47 does not. Put a Kalashnikov magazine against a Vzor 58 magazine, and they are not interchangeable, not close, not compatible in any direction. Czechoslovakia had been told to abandon its own cartridge. It had not been told to abandon its own engineering, and it didn't. What happened to the factory's name in exactly this period is where the story gets harder to explain as coincidence. Sometime between 1958 and 1965, Uhersky Brod was folded into a state enterprise called Zavody Renové Revolus. Narodny Podnik, Vsetin, the October Revolution Works, national enterprise, headquartered in a neighboring town. The plant kept building the Vzor 58, and from 1961, the Vzor 61 Scorpion machine pistol, more than 200,000 of which would eventually be produced. That tiny machine pistol ended up in the hands of Warsaw Pact armies, African militaries in Angola and Libya, Asian buyers as far as North Korea and Vietnam, and even a Yugoslav licensed copy called the M84. A global footprint the men who built it were never credited for at home. Its own commercial product lines, air rifles, target pistols, and sporting arms were centrally reassigned elsewhere by the same bureaucracy. A factory that had just designed a rifle good enough to surprise the Soviet Union was now a subordinate line item inside a company named for a revolution it had had no part in 4 decades earlier in a different country. A rifle good enough to beat Soviet expectations. A company not permitted to put its own name on the crate. Management shifted again in 1965, this time to Zbrojovka Brno. And in 1968, the year Soviet tanks rolled into Prague to crush a different reform movement. The factory was renamed once more from precision machine tooling to the plain, generic Zbrojovka. Zbrojovka Brno's own portfolio leaned increasingly toward agricultural machinery, and Uhersky Brod, even as it kept exporting service weapons and from 1969, developing what would become the CZ-75 pistol under designer František Kauky. a design influential enough to help define the entire category of high-capacity 9mm service pistols, was pulled further from its own founding purpose. To keep its workforce employed, the plant began building components for turboprop aircraft engines in the early 1970s and hydraulic parts for tractors in 1975. By 1983, the reorganization reached its logical endpoint. Uherský Brod became part of Agrozet, an agricultural engineering group, its machinery aging past the point where it could support the next generation of service rifle the Army wanted. Its most reliable source of new equipment, the export profits from a handgun rather than any investment tied to why the factory existed. The Vizor 58 line ran until 1984, ending at 919,650 rifles built since 1959. Even inside Agrozet, the CZ-75 kept selling abroad, and the hard currency it earned bought the factory its first computer numerically controlled machines, small borrowed technological independence purchased entirely from a pistol nobody at the ministry had asked for. The obsolescence went the other direction too. Engineers who wanted to design the next generation of service rifle, the successor to the Vizor 58, were working on machinery that a tractor parts budget had no reason to modernize, so the successor simply did not get built while the company belonged to Agrozet. A gunmaker with no path to build its next gun is not a thriving gunmaker, no matter what the production totals from a decade earlier said. 1984 ended the rifle. It would take a different ideology's collapse to nearly end the company that built it. Here is the part most retellings of this story get wrong. They treat communism's damage to Uherský Brod as a matter of shortages, censorship, or Cold War paranoia, the standard furniture of any Eastern Bloc story. The real mechanism was administrative. And it was almost boring. A functioning, technically excellent arms manufacturer was folded, relabeled, and subordinated through 5 separate reorganizations in 35 years. Precision Machine Tooling, October Revolution Works, Zbrojovka, Agrozet, until the name on its gate had almost nothing to do with what its engineers actually built, and the men who ran it answered to agricultural planners, rather than to anyone who understood a rifle. That is the first killing, and it is the quieter one, because nobody signed an order to destroy anything. They simply kept filing the paperwork that moved a rifle factory further away from itself, year after year, until arms production was a tolerated sideline inside a tractor company, rather than the reason the company existed. The second killing is the one nobody predicts, because it arrives disguised as liberation. The communist regime collapsed in November 1989. Uherský Brod regained its historic name, Česká Zbrojovka, that same year, and then, freed to make its own decisions for the first time in over 4 decades, the company chose to stop developing and producing automatic military firearms almost entirely for an extended period, because the only customer that had ever wanted them at scale, a Warsaw Pact state, no longer existed in the form that could buy them. Tractor hydraulics and aircraft gearboxes were dropped too, and the freed capacity went almost entirely into the commercial CZ-75 pistol line, just to keep the workforce paid through the 1990s. Communism spent 4 decades erasing the name on the gate. Its collapse spent the next 2 decades erasing the very thing that name used to mean. Neither killing looks like the other. The first one buried an identity inside paperwork while the guns kept rolling off the line. The second one freed the identity and then starved the guns instead. A factory cannot easily survive either. This one is still the only Czechoslovak small arms maker with an unbroken line back to the interwar era. So it survived both, which is closer to a miracle than a business plan. Reclaiming its name in 1989 did not, on its own, pay the bills. Česká Zbrojovka became a joint stock company on the 1st of May, 1992, and spent the rest of that decade rebuilding around the one product line the free market already wanted, the CZ-75 family, a pistol good enough and unpatented internationally that Italian, Israeli, and Turkish manufacturers all reverse-engineered their own unlicensed versions of it, while it opened a distribution subsidiary in the United States in 1997, first in California, then relocated to Kansas City in 1998. A single majority Czech owner consolidated the company in 2001. In 2005, it bought the American revolver maker Dan Wesson. In 2006, new management arrived and started, cautiously, funding development again. And by 2010, the company had absorbed the surviving firearms operations of its old parent, Zbrojovka Brno, outright, the subordinate finally outgrowing the enterprise that had once renamed it. The gap in military rifles did not close until 2011, when Uherski Brod finally began producing a new generation of service weapons for the Czech armed forces. The CZ-805 BRN assault rifle, the Scorpion Evo 3 submachine gun, and an accompanying grenade launcher, the first indigenous automatic rifle program the plant had fielded since the Vizor 58 line went dark in 1984, a gap of 27 years that the fall of communism, not communism itself, had opened. The Vizor 58 itself never fully retired. It remains to this day a standard issue rifle of the Slovak Army, and Czech forces have kept it in training and reserve stocks long after the BRN took over frontline service. In February 2022, the Czech government donated 5,000 Vizor 58 rifles to Ukraine, alongside Scorpion submachine guns, Vizor 59 machine guns, and Dragunov rifles, sending a weapon designed under Soviet cartridge orders in 1956 into a war against the country that had issued them. In 2021, the company, by then organized under the holding Česká Zbrojovka Group formed in 2018, bought Colt's Manufacturing, the American firm that had spent a century as the benchmark every other pistol maker was measured against, and took the name Colt CZ Group the following year. When that holding was created, it set itself the public target of €1 billion in annual sales by the end of 2025. In 2024, the group reported revenue of 22.4 billion Czech koruna, up more than 50% from the year before, from a plant that now employs around 1,800 people and ships to more than 100 countries, putting a factory once buried inside a farm equipment trust, within sight of a target most Cold War planners would have found absurd. A company once folded into a tractor conglomerate under a name honoring a revolution it had no part in now owns the name Colt. The gate at Uherski Brod once read October Revolution Works over a shop floor that was, at that exact moment, building a rifle good enough to surprise the Soviets. It now reads Colt CZ Group, over a shop floor building rifles for the Czech Army, and pistols carried by police departments on the other side of the ocean. If you know another company whose name was erased by the state that needed it most, and that clawed its way back anyway, tell us which one in the comments. We're always looking for the next one to cover. See you in the next one.